The air inside the temple trembled with incense and heat. 1,000 years of prayers clung to the sandstone walls, heavy as dust. Beneath the great columns of Karnak, a little girl stood barefoot on the burning floor. Her name was Neferet, and in her small hands she carried a single white lotus. They told her it was the flower of purity, a gift for the gods. She did not know that it would become her farewell. The priests moved like shadows in the orange light. Their heads were shaved, their eyes outlined in black. In the center stood the high priestess, her face pale as bone. She lifted a bronze blade and spoke words that echoed against the stone. Neferet felt the world grow still. The sound of the river outside faded until only her heartbeat remained. One cut for the world of men, one for the blood that made her human, one for the self that would no longer belong to her. The strands of her hair fell slowly, glimmering in the sun before sinking into the dust. A drop of blood touched the white petals of the lotus and turned them red. She tried to look up, but the priestess pressed her head down. The child stayed silent, her tears mixed with the oil on her skin. Somewhere far away, the gods were watching, or perhaps they never were. When it was over, the blade was wiped clean. The priestess nodded. The girl would now live for the gods, not for herself. The doors of the temple closed behind her, and the world outside became only a memory. That was the first night of her sacred captivity, the moment when faith replaced freedom. If you wish to uncover the stories hidden beneath stone and silence, follow this voice, like this video, and subscribe to our channel. The first light of dawn did not bring freedom. It slid across the stone walls of the temple and stopped at the edge of darkness. In that darkness, Neferet opened her eyes. The air was heavy with incense, sweet and suffocating. Her skin still carried the scent of the oil used in the ceremony. The silence was complete. No birds, no river, only the slow breathing of others who had also been chosen. Her life as a novice began in a corridor where words were forbidden. The high priestess had declared that speech was the root of chaos, and only silence could lead to purity. The girls moved through the hall like shadows, their linen robes whispering against the stone. They were taught to bow, to keep their eyes lowered, to let obedience guide every motion. Each day was divided by bells and prayers. Each gesture was memorized until it became instinct. Older women, veiled and faceless, oversaw their training. They spoke in soft tones that carried no warmth. They taught how to wash, how to kneel, how to smile in front of priests, how to erase the voice within. A mistake brought punishment. A wrong movement, a glance too bold, even a sigh could lead to hours of isolation in the dark. The purpose was to empty the self. The temple wanted vessels, not hearts. The high priestess walked among them every morning. Her eyes were calm, but her presence demanded submission. She believed she was saving them from the impurity of the world, shaping them into holy instruments. She did not see cruelty in her actions, only order. When she raised her hand, the girls knelt. When she spoke, they trembled. Neferet learned to move with care. Her hands obeyed before her thoughts could form. Yet at night, when the chants faded and the lamps went out, she touched the scar on her scalp and remembered the girl who had carried a lotus in the sun. That memory was a forbidden thing, but it glowed softly inside her like a hidden flame. One night she dreamed of the river. The sound of water came through her sleep, faint and distant. She saw her mother's face, though it blurred like smoke. When she woke, the dream clung to her skin. She tried to pray it away, but her lips trembled. The high priestess noticed. For the first time, their eyes met. In that gaze, the woman saw something she had not seen in years, defiance shaped by innocence. It frightened her more than rebellion. It reminded her of the day she herself had been a child, standing in the same hall, her name taken, her faith rewritten. She turned away quickly, whispering a prayer for discipline, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. The training continued. The girls were taught to prepare offerings of bread, honey, and oil. They memorized chants that praised the rising sun and mourned its descent. Their voices blended until no one could tell them apart. Individuality vanished like smoke before the altar. When one of them cried, the others pretended not to hear. Compassion was forbidden. To comfort someone was to invite punishment. The temple fed them, clothed them, and stole their sleep. Time folded upon itself until there was no past, no future, only repetition. Neferet began to understand that silence had a sound. It was the echo of things lost. Every prayer deepened the emptiness inside her, yet within that emptiness, something began to stir a question without words. It grew slowly quiet but constant, like the heartbeat of a secret. The high priestess sensed it. She stood before the altar one evening, watching the smoke rise in spirals. She told herself that the gods demanded perfection, but a shadow of doubt flickered behind her eyes. She had devoted her life to a faith that promised purity through suffering. Now she wondered whether suffering had become the faith itself. That night, the temple seemed colder. The lamps burned lower. Neferet sat awake, her hands folded on her lap. Outside, she heard the wind moving through the cracks of the wall. It sounded like water flowing toward a place she could no longer reach. She closed her eyes and imagined stepping into it, letting the current carry her away from stone and silence. But morning would come, and the ritual would begin again. The bells would ring, the prayers would rise, and the girls would bow. Somewhere in the darkness, the lotus of memory still waited to bloom again. When the season of the rising sun arrived, the temple prepared for the grand festival. For weeks, the air filled with chants and the scent of burning myrrh. The walls were cleaned with river water, the floors polished until they reflected the torchlight. To the outside world, it was a celebration of life and creation, a sacred renewal of harmony between gods and earth. To the girls within it was the time of selection. Neferet stood among them, wrapped in a thin robe of white linen. The high priestess walked down the line, her hands touching each girl's head in silence. The chosen would enter the inner sanctum at dusk to serve the god in the rite of divine union. No one spoke. Each girl knew what awaited behind those heavy bronze doors, though no words were ever allowed to describe it. When Neferet's turn came, the priestess's fingers lingered on her forehead. Her skin was cold. Their eyes met again, the same unspoken recognition flickering between them. The priestess lowered her hand and whispered a prayer that only she could hear. Then she nodded. Neferet was among the chosen. At sunset, the temple bells began to sound. The girls were led through a corridor lined with statues of gods, their faces serene and unfeeling. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. The air grew warmer as they approached the sanctum. Inside, the walls glowed red from the torches, and the scent of resin and oil was thick enough to taste. They were told to kneel before the altar. Golden vessels surrounded them, each filled with offerings of honey and wine. The priests stood in silence, their faces painted with divine symbols. The ceremony began with music from reed flutes, slow and haunting. It was meant to call the gods down from the heavens. Neferet felt her heart pounding. The lotus of memory she had hidden in her mind opened again. She thought of the river and its freedom, of her mother's voice fading in the wind. But as the chants rose, those thoughts dissolved. Hands lifted her chin, and the high priestess stood before her, reciting words that spoke of union and rebirth. The ritual was not described as an act of harm. It was framed as a moment of divine grace. The gods were said to pass through mortal vessels to renew the world. Yet beneath the words of purity, Neferet sensed something else. The eyes of the priests did not hold holiness, but hunger. Their prayers sounded like commands. When the music stopped, silence filled the chamber. The high priestess anointed each girl with oil, marking their foreheads with the symbol of the sun. She moved slowly, her movements graceful but heavy with something unspoken. In that silence, Neferet felt the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders. She was no longer a person. She was tradition shaped into flesh. Hours passed like a dream. The torches burned lower. When it was done, the girls were led away without a word. The air outside felt colder. The stars above the temple seemed too distant to care. Neferet walked with the others, her steps unsteady. The fragrance of oil clung to her skin. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her tried to speak, but the voice could not rise. That night, she lay awake on her mat, staring into the darkness. The temple was silent again, but the echo of the chants still pulsed in her veins. The world she had known was gone, replaced by ritual and shadow. She wondered if the gods truly heard the prayers, or if they too were silent statues carved by human hands. The high priestess prayed alone before dawn. Her hands trembled as she placed offerings at the altar. She told herself that all of it was sacred, that suffering was necessary for order to endure. But her reflection in the polished bronze looked older, almost hollow. She closed her eyes and whispered, as if to herself, that she would not remember the faces of the girls. Outside, the first light touched the temple columns, turning the stone to gold. The festival would continue for 7 more days. The songs of worship would fill the air again. Yet beneath the sound of flutes and prayers, something deeper began to awaken. In one girl's heart, silence was no longer peace. It was the sound of something breaking. The festival ended, but its echo remained. For days, the temple smelled of oil and smoke, and the air carried a quiet exhaustion. The girls returned to their corridors, moving slower, their eyes hollow but obedient. Among them, Neferet walked with her head lowered, her steps careful, her silence heavier than before. Inside her body, a faint ache began to grow. At first she ignored it, thinking it was part of the rituals. But as the moons passed, her form changed. The high priestess knew. She did not speak of it, but her gaze lingered longer each time she saw Neferet. She remembered other girls before her chosen, and changed each one a vessel for what they called the divine seed. The temple had names for every stage, prayers for every pain, words to disguise what was truly happening. They said the gods had blessed her, that the light of Amun now lived within her. Yet beneath those words, both women understood what the blessing meant. Neferet was hidden from the others, taken to a chamber deeper within the temple where no song was heard. The walls there were thick, the air dry, the only light coming from a small opening in the ceiling. The high priestess visited her each morning. She brought offerings of fruit and water, and recited blessings that sounded more like apologies. She told Neferet to remain pure, to speak to no one, to let the god inside her grow. Months passed in silence. Neferet's body became heavy, her thoughts fragile. Sometimes she would place her hands on her stomach and feel movement like waves. She wondered if what grew inside her was a child or a curse. The priestess prayed that she would never ask. It was easier that way. When the time came, the birth was quiet. The temple did not allow cries. Only the midwives were present, their faces veiled. Neferet's strength broke with the pain, yet she made no sound. When it was over, she heard a small cry, and then footsteps fading away. The midwives carried the infant out before she could see it. The room fell back into silence. The smell of blood mixed with the incense. The high priestess entered hours later. She looked at Neferet's pale face, at her trembling hands. The girl stared at the ceiling, eyes empty, lips parted, but voiceless. The priestess wanted to say something, but no words felt holy enough. She touched Neferet's shoulder gently. The gesture was small, human, and forbidden. Then she whispered that the gods were pleased. Neferet closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, running down to the corner of her mouth. It tasted of salt and truth. The priestess turned away quickly, ashamed of her own weakness. She had once believed that every child born of the temple was sacred, that their pain was the foundation of order. But seeing the girl before her, she could no longer find comfort in faith. The child was taken to the house of priests to be raised as one of divine blood. No mother was ever allowed to see her child again. The girls were told that the gods claimed them, that love belonged only to heaven. But in the quiet nights behind locked doors, the mothers of the temple wept into their robes. Their tears never touched the floor. As Neferet recovered, she was assigned to a new role. No longer a novice, she became one of the mothers of the temple, charged with guiding new initiates through their rituals. Her body had healed, but her spirit had turned to stone. She spoke softly, moved slowly, her eyes distant. The younger girls whispered that she had seen the gods. They did not know that what she had seen was silence. The high priestess grew older too. Her faith faltered in moments she dared not admit. She sometimes watched Neferet during the ceremonies and felt a weight she could not name. Perhaps she saw in the girl what she had lost in herself. The temple continued its rhythm. The prayers rose, the bells rang, the rituals repeated. From outside, everything seemed eternal and serene. But beneath the marble floors in the dark chambers of the mothers, the air trembled with quiet grief. Neferet learned to live inside that stillness, to breathe without hope, to exist like one of the statues that lined the halls. And yet deep inside, the memory of the river still moved. It was faint, but it reminded her that once there had been light, that did not burn water, that did not command love, that did not demand silence. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, the world still lived, but in the temple that memory had become the most forbidden prayer of all. The night began with a sound that should not have existed. It was faint at first, a note carried through the corridors like a trembling thread of air. Someone was singing. The melody was low, ancient, a lullaby that no ritual had ever allowed. The temple walls, so used to silence, seemed to listen. Neferet woke to that sound. She sat up on her reed mat, her heart echoing the rhythm of the song. It came from one of the lower chambers, the place where the mothers slept. For years, no one had dared to raise their voice within these walls. She rose barefoot and followed the vibration through the dark halls. When she reached the source, she found 3 women kneeling near a dying lamp. Their faces were half hidden, but their voices wove together in trembling harmony. It was not a hymn to any god. It was a song of memory, a melody of the river. Neferet stood in the doorway, frozen. The music broke something inside her, something that had been locked since the day she entered the temple. She stepped forward without thinking and whispered her own name. The sound of it startled even her. It had been years since she had spoken it aloud. The women stopped singing. One of them lifted her head, tears shining in her eyes. She whispered back her name too, then another, and another. Soon the small room filled with names that had been erased, names carried on voices that trembled but did not stop. The sound rose and spread like smoke through the corridors. Women awoke from their mats, drawn by a memory they did not understand. The song grew louder, swelling into a chorus of forbidden words. For the first time in centuries, the temple was filled not with prayer, but with human sound. At the top of the stairway, the high priestess stood. She could hear them clearly. Her body shook not from anger, but from recognition. Those names had once been hers too. She remembered the child she had been, the voice she had buried to become pure. She closed her eyes and listened. When the guards arrived, they hesitated. The song was not rebellion. It was grief turned to light. The women were not shouting, they were remembering. But to the temple, memory was the greatest threat of all. The high priestess descended the stairs, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow. The crowd parted. Neferet knelt, expecting punishment. The priestess looked down at her, her lips trembling. Then, instead of raising her voice, she whispered Neferet's name. A silence followed. The sound of it was almost sacred. The women looked at one another, tears running freely. The priestess reached for the lamp and held it above the altar. She let the flame touch the old parchment scrolls stacked nearby. The fire caught quickly, devouring years of laws and confessions. The guards stepped back. No one stopped her. The flames climbed the walls, licking the painted faces of gods that had demanded obedience. Smoke rose to the ceiling, curling through the carvings like a final offering. Neferet stood beside her. The light of the fire reflected in her eyes. For the first time, she did not bow. Around them, the others began to sing, again their voices soft but steady, the sound of women reclaiming their own existence. The roof cracked. Sparks rained down like falling stars. The priestess turned to Neferet and spoke softly. She said that if faith had any meaning left, it was to protect what was human. Then she walked into the flames. Neferet reached out, but the smoke swallowed the figure. The song continued rising above the roar of the fire until the temple itself began to crumble. By dawn, only ash remained. The river wind carried it through the ruins, spreading it across the sand. Neferet, her hair singed, stood among the embers. She felt no triumph, no despair, only the calm of something finally set free. She gathered a handful of ash and let it fall into the wind. The air shimmered with light, and for a moment, she thought she heard the laughter of children, faint but real. She knew then that the temple would be rebuilt, but the silence would never sound the same again. The flames had not destroyed faith. They had burned away its disguise. Centuries passed, and the desert reclaimed what the fire had left behind. The temple of Amun fell into ruin. Sand buried the stones, wind erased the carvings, and silence returned not as worship, but as forgetfulness. Yet beneath the layers of dust, something waited. In the winter of a distant century, a group of archaeologists arrived from the north. Their tents stood beside the river, where reeds whispered in the wind. The leader, a woman named Dr. Ilara Voss, had spent her life searching for traces of forgotten civilizations. The locals spoke of a temple swallowed by the earth, a place where no birds flew. She called it superstition, until the first spade struck stone. What they uncovered was unlike anything she had seen. The remains of walls blackened by fire, the outlines of statues melted by heat, and beneath them a network of chambers that seemed untouched by time. The air was dry and heavy, carrying a faint scent of resin and ash. On the first night, as the team set their lamps, she noticed something strange. The silence inside the ruins felt alive, as if it were listening. They descended into the lower halls. There, among the fallen pillars, they found rows of sealed urns covered in dust. Each bore a mark carved in a language half familiar. Inside, instead of relics, were small fragments of bone and dried petals. Dr. Voss held one to the light. It was a lotus petal, perfectly preserved, as if waiting for someone to remember. Further down, they reached a chamber sealed by a single slab of sandstone. It took hours to open. When it finally shifted, a breath of ancient air escaped, carrying the scent of burnt oil. Inside lay the remains of women wrapped in linen that had turned the color of desert earth. There were no inscriptions, no royal emblems, only their stillness. Dr. Voss walked among them with reverence. Her light fell upon something near the center of the chamber, a small tablet of stone engraved with symbols that shimmered faintly. She brushed away the sand and realized the markings were names. dozens of them carved in uneven lines, each beginning with the same word, daughter. She read the first few and felt a tremor in her chest. These were not titles of nobility, but names of ordinary women. The last line, almost faded, read Neferet. Her hands shook. She did not know why the name moved her so deeply, but she felt as though the air itself had changed. She called her team to document the discovery, but when they entered the chamber, the temperature had risen. The candles flickered as if disturbed by unseen breath. That night, no one slept. Some claimed to hear faint singing from the direction of the ruins. Dr. Voss sat outside her tent, the desert stretching silent under the stars. She looked toward the dark outline of the temple and thought she saw a flicker of light, soft and golden, like the reflection of fire. At dawn, she returned alone. The sand was undisturbed, but the air smelled faintly of smoke. In the central chamber, she found her lamp still burning, though she had extinguished it before leaving. Its flame was steady, calm, almost watchful. She approached the tablet again. This time, as the light touched its surface, she saw faint carvings she had missed before. Beneath the list of names was a single line written in smaller script. It read, "We lived, and they will hear us again." Her breath caught. She touched the stone, feeling the fine grooves left by hands that had refused to vanish. In that moment, she understood the fire had not destroyed the temple. It had preserved its truth beneath ash and time. Dr. Voss ordered the site sealed for further study, but the memory of that chamber followed her long after she left Egypt. She dreamed of women standing among pillars of flame, their faces calm, their voices rising like wind over water. Years later, her report would call the site the Tomb of the Nameless. Scholars debated its meaning, arguing it was a burial for priestesses, a monument to fertility, or a symbol of lost cults. But Dr. Voss never joined those debates. She had felt something that no theory could explain. In her final notes found after her death, she wrote a single line: "Some silences do not end. They wait for the right voice to return." In a quiet hall of the Cairo Museum, the air felt heavy and still. Beneath the glass roof stood a single display case, small and unremarkable. Inside rested a cracked stone tablet, its carvings pale and almost invisible. Most visitors passed without stopping, but one woman lingered. She stood before the glass as the late light touched the surface. The lines appeared for a moment like veins of gold beneath the dust. They were not the marks of kings or gods. They were names, each one fragile and uneven, carved by hands that once trembled. The first few were clear. The last ones faded like breath on water. Near the bottom, one name still caught the light: Neferet. The woman leaned closer. She could not read the language, but she could feel it. The air seemed warmer near the glass. She imagined the hands that once carved those names. She imagined the temple before dawn, the sound of wind passing through columns, the faint scent of oil and ashes. She did not know their story yet. She understood their silence. It was the same silence that lives in every heart that has learned to endure. Outside, the wind moved through the city, carrying grains of sand from the desert. It brushed the walls of the museum and whispered through the window frames. The sound was faint and rhythmic, like a memory breathing. The woman closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she heard something under the quiet. Not sorrow, not fear. Something closer to remembrance. The world had changed 1,000 times since the fire that erased their temple. Empires had fallen. Names had vanished. Yet what was true in them had endured. Not through monuments or glory, but through the quiet strength that survives destruction. The priests had built their faith in power. The women had built theirs in patience. What the fire consumed, the silence protected. The woman opened her eyes again. The museum lights began to fade. Around her, the hall emptied, but she stayed. The stone caught the last beam of sunlight, and shimmered faintly. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the cold glass. The surface trembled as if something inside was breathing back. She whispered, "I hear you." Her voice disappeared into the still air, but the warmth remained. Outside, the Nile glowed in the dusk. The same river that once carried ashes now carried light. The same current that bore loss now held memory. She turned to leave. At the doorway, she paused. The silence behind her no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like peace. Centuries ago, those women had been erased. Yet their silence had outlived kingdoms, because silence born from truth does not die. It waits. That night, the city pulsed with life. The woman walked through the streets, her steps steady, her heart calm. Somewhere behind her in the quiet hall, the tablet rested in the dark. The carvings caught a trace of moonlight, and for an instant seemed to move. Not with sound, but with breath. Empires fall when they forget how to listen. The world endures only through those who remember. If you can feel that breath beneath the silence, if you believe that truth still lives beneath the dust, then stay with us. Like this video, share their story, and subscribe to our channel, where history remembers what power tried to erase, and where silence begins to speak again.